Future Horizons is proud to present Dr. Tony Attwood, internationally recognized expert on Asperger's syndrome. Join us now in welcoming Dr. Tony Attwood.
Well, thank you and welcome to this morning. I may start with a little bit of background explanation of my clinical history and why I've become interested in autism and Asperger syndrome, which started now 27 years ago when I saw two children while I was a volunteer at a special school called Russell and Sarah. And these two autistic children who looked like any other kid, there was nothing you could physically say that they were different, in a way seemed to contradict all the established theories of child development. They had major difficulties in understanding and coping with things that the other kids would be entranced by. Socializing, for example, they hated. And yet they would be absolutely fascinated by spinning things and sifting sand. And I really felt that these children were different in a number of ways. And at that point, I decided to pursue a career in autism to find out why such children were unusual and ways to help them. Now, in that time, I have known probably over 10,000 individuals on the autistic spectrum. Now, that includes babies who are blind and autistic, right through to people in their 80s who have autism. Now, that also includes those who are profoundly affected by autism with high support needs, extremely challenging and difficult behavior, right through to, I suppose you could call the other end of the spectrum, university professors with Asperger's syndrome, because I do use the phrase, universities are sheltered workshops for the socially challenged. And so, quite often at university, I do identify a number of people with Asperger's syndrome. I've also known people who have been living in large 3,000-bed government institutions and those who have been living in the mansions of millionaires who have access to all the resources they could hope for. So over that length of time, I have seen the extremely broad spectrum or continuum of autism. Now, one of the things that I noticed over the years of watching those children grow up is that the nature of autism changes as the child matures. And some children may be born in the classic aloof, classic autistic child that Leo Kanner described, but can eventually talk, go to ordinary schools, but is still different in a number of ways. Now, what I'm now going to focus on is some work originally done by Lorna Wing, Judith Gould, and myself, which looks at the autistic continuum and describing different positions on that continuum. Now, I'll start with the term aloof. Now, this describes the person with the severest form of autism. Now, here, the child avoids interactions at all costs. They really don't like being around people. And they're upset by the mere proximity, and they may learn various obnoxious habits or actions to make sure that people leave them alone. There may be little speech, and here the child has major difficulty in uttering words and is ominously too silent. And a lot of self-stimulatory play. The child is fascinated by sensory experience. They want to find out, what does it sound like when I tap? What does it feel like when I touch it? What does it taste like, etc. So it's pure sensory experience. Now, this is probably the general public's view of classic autism, and it does exist. And that may be the description of the child at 2 or 3 years old when autism is first diagnosed. However, it may be, yes, the ultimate destiny as an adult, but it may be a transitory stage, and the child may move on to the next position on the continuum. And this we call the passive group. And this group actually will go up to people for something they want. Now, for example, they want to go outside in what I call the garden and you would call the yard, to go out to play, but the door is closed and they need to open it, and they know that a hand opens the door. So they will look at hand height for a convenient hand, grab the hand and take it to the door. So in a way, you're almost used as a disconnected object for a particular purpose, or for physical stimulation. And here you have the feeling that your body is an adventure playground. And the child climbs up you and pokes various bits and plays with the dangly bits and long strands, etc., and clambers all over you as a nice, soft adventure playground. There's a strong preference for solitary play, and here the child will play in the sand pit or the swimming pool for hours on end and be quite content with their own company and transfixed by what they're doing. Speech is limited and may include echolalia, where the child can only speak by echoing what you say. And here the child may have inner language, but requires what we call an external prompt to initiate speech. So here the child requires you to say a word before they can say it, or they have to see a picture to label it, or they watch their favorite videotape again and again and again and remember the dialogue of the videotape. So you have a child who may be interested in Thomas the Tank Engine, has memorized all the dialogue of Thomas the Tank Engine, and at the right time, in the right context, uses an appropriate phrase from Thomas the Tank Engine, but it's not original, it's borrowed from the text. And that's one, not the only reason, why such videos are fascinating for such kids, because it gives you a means of speech. Here, there's also an interest in symmetry, and the child tries to make order out of chaos, and things are lined up and put in perspective. Now, the trouble is, of course, once a room is set in a particular pattern, if you move a chair an inch out of the way, the child immediately recognizes and it's got to be put in that position. So there's a fascination with symmetry and collecting specific objects. Now, other kids will collect whatever is popular and the media in their advertisements say you must buy. Now, here the child is fascinated by odd things. Now, some of them are unusual. I've known children who have collected drain covers. You would have those here? Yes, drain covers. We had one child who, whenever he visited anyone's house, immediately went to the toilet to collect toilet brushes. And he would collect as many as he could and would have extreme distress when his parents left that he had to return the toilet brushes. And these objects are spotted from 1,000 paces. The child is delighted to see them and is very distressed when they have to go away. And it seems that this is a security blanket that must go everywhere with them. So this is the passive group. Again, this may be the diagnostic starting point, and this profile describes the child at 2 or 3. It may be their ultimate destiny as an adult, or they may move on to the next stage. And the next stage we call active but odd, which really clearly defines a very simple way that the child actively goes up to people, but when they do, they are very odd indeed. And such children are actually attention-seeking. And people will say, he can't be autistic because he likes attention. The trouble is, he does silly, repetitive things to gain attention, and when he's got your attention, he doesn't know how to maintain the interaction. So what happens is that the person approaches others very often, but a very short duration. Also, the speech tends to be restricted now to repetitive questions, often questions that the child knows the answer to. So they'll come up to you and say, what colour's your car? When's your birthday? What's your mother's name? And they will go on again and again on these set questions. It's as though they have to know the answer, and that's their only vocabulary in a social situation. So there seems to be here restricted questions as the major form of vocal communication, but a conspicuous lack of social play with peers. The child goes up to adults, total strangers, without any concern at all. But other kids are those things that interfere with what you're doing, they get in the way, and they really either prefer to be by themselves or in adult company. Now here, there is not a fascination with sensory experience or symmetry, but a fascination with a specific topic, often transport. It tends to be trains, trucks, tractors, vehicles of some description, or later on things like dinosaurs, insects or electronics, etc. But there's a fascination with a topic, or sometimes in the teenage years, a fascination with a particular person. So the main themes have continued throughout the child's development, but move perhaps to a more advanced level. Now, active but odd may be, again, the diagnostic description of the young child. It may be their ultimate destiny as an adult, or a transitory stage on the way to Asperger syndrome. And this is how our current knowledge of Asperger syndrome was born, by watching children who were aloof, typical Kanner's autism at 2 and 3 years old, no speech, very, very autistic. For reasons we can't understand, by the age of 4 or 6, developed the ability to speak, or by intensive early intervention programs, acquired these skills. So they were now going to school. They could talk, but they couldn't have a conversation. They were intellectually as able as the other kids, but they lacked social common sense. They were fascinated by obscure encyclopedic knowledge of various topics, but was not necessarily what was popular with their peer group. So these children were no longer classically autistic in the traditional sense, but they still had a ghosting of the main signs. Now, Leo Kanner in the mid-1940s described the general public's classic aloof autistic child. His fellow countryman, Hans Asperger, also from Austria, described what he originally called autistic, but we now call Asperger's syndrome, children at the upper end of the autistic continuum. And what I'm going to go through now is the signs that we look for Asperger's syndrome in a diagnostic assessment. Now, one of the key features we look at is the social skill of that child. And really you do need to socialize with the child, to play with them, watch them in the playground, or with older children, interact with them to check certain specific social skills. One of them is the degree of reciprocity, the balance between the two of you, the fair share of airspace and time. So here, the child may do one of two things. Either they come up to you, have you got a cylinder mower? Have you got a cylinder mower in the garage? Where's your cylinder mower? What happened to the cylinder? And you just go, what? And you have this immediate intrusion into your personal space and conversation with a topic that may not be relevant, and that person has an enthusiasm and breaking your codes of conduct, which sort of takes you quite aback. And they will dominate the interaction. They are in your face, literally. Or you do a lot of work to get the child to respond. You feed them a lot of questions. You're very kind and supportive in the social interaction, but you're not getting the degree of welcome as you would expect. The child is much more content to do what they're doing than to socialize. And certainly there's a lack of inclusion of the other person and other children in what the child is doing. And to a certain extent, this lack of inclusion may lead the child to develop strategies to maintain solitude. So in the playground, they may use obscene words or physical actions to make children go away. They're not being aggressive in the sense for dominance or retribution over that individual. They just want to be by themselves. There isn't that degree of inclusion and welcome. The next area we look at is eye contact, and I'm going to go through in a later section more detail of how to teach eye contact within this group. But what I want to explain at this point is there are two features we're looking for. Eye contact is used for two reasons. First of all, what we call social punctuation. In punctuation, to start the sentence, you have a capital letter. To start the interaction, you look. Now, this is a skill that waiters have of going through a restaurant without giving eye contact because they don't want to serve people. And you know as soon as you've got eye contact that there the interaction begins. So you start with eye contact. You also have something perhaps that's important to say. In a sentence, you would underline it or put it in italics. If it's important, you look to add emphasis. Also, if it is something that is emotional, an exclamation mark, you would look at the person, but in your body language, on your face, would be the emotion consistent with the storyline. So, the next one is that if you have a question mark, or you're confused, you look at the person to add emphasis. And at the final point, which I would call a full stop, but you guys would call a period, is you look to signal the end of the interaction. So we regulate the interaction or punctuate it with eye contact at key points. Now, first thing I do is check, does this occur at the right time? Did that person look at me when I anticipated eye contact? Now, that's one function. But I'll give you an illustration of a young man, 16 years old, with classic Asperger syndrome, very fluent speech, and an encyclopedic knowledge of astronomy. However, his parents had said that this knowledge is embarrassing and that really it would be best if he didn't talk about it, especially to me in a clinical setting. So as I was talking to him, diagnostically, knowing about the interest is very important. So I was giving every encouragement about the new Mars landings and all those sorts of things as fascinating and interesting. I wanted to find out more about what he knew. But behind me, his parents were saying, shh, 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 don't talk about it. And in his confusion of my encouragement and his parents' negation, he closed his eyes. I then talked to him of my problem of talking to somebody who's closed their eyes. And he said, quote, "Why would I want to look at you when I know where you are?" And perhaps that one sentence describes the whole of Asperger syndrome. Why would I want to look at you when I know where you are? Now, the reason we do this is to read the face of the other person, because our social brain needs feedback on what other people are thinking and feeling, because we use that to monitor, regulate and change our topics, opinions, body language, etc. That channel of communication is constantly on. You have your social brain switched on and communicating all the time. And here, with Asperger syndrome, they are often not picking up those signals. And as Candy said, when she looks at a face, she said, "I look, but don't see." And here that person is confused by all those changes. It also means that if they are not picking up your facial expression to indicate your thoughts and feelings, most of our codes of social conduct are designed not to offend the thoughts and feelings of others. And that's why a lot of such children's behavior appears rude, inconsiderate, lawless, naughty, badly brought up, but they're just not aware how their behavior affects other people. So eye contact is crucial to check, does the child read my facial expression? Next thing I do is definition of friendship. Here I often ask the child, "And who are your friends at school?" They'll give me, "Oh, there's so-and-so, 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 so-and-so." But the parents behind are going, no, well, they're an acquaintance. They've just arrived at the school. They're very nice and kind and so on. But I don't challenge that as far as the child is concerned. They are their friends. But I ask, who's your best friend? Of course, in Australia, we say, who's your best mate? And they'll say whoever it is. And I'll say, David. Why is David your friend? Now, ordinary children have developmental stages from 3-year-olds right through to teenagers in understanding the concept of friendship that goes from somebody you just play with to somebody who helps you, somebody who cares for you, etc., right the way through to aspects of personality of somebody of similar likes, experiences, etc. And there are clear developmental stages. Now, for time purposes, I haven't got the opportunity to go through that. But what I do is look at the child's intellectual ability and their level of maturity in the concept of friendship. Because many of these kids will play successfully with much younger children or older children who are very nice and kind to them. So one of the things I do diagnostically is look at their definition of friendship and clearly check, is it consistent with their intellectual abilities? Now, in a later session this morning, I will be going through how do you teach friendship skills, and I will go through those stages so you can see at each particular stage what is the curriculum to teach that skill. Because these children have to learn the social curriculum. Not only the academic curriculum, but the social curriculum too. So they are under enormous stress. I also ask for a description of the teacher. Who's your teacher? Oh, Mrs. Smith. Oh, Mrs. Smith. I don't know Mrs. Smith. What's she like? And the sort of kids go, she likes good work. Well, which may be true. And I say, what sort of a person is she? And they'll say things like, she's a girl, which may be true. And she may be delighted by that term, but it may not be an accurate description. She is a lady, a girl. Or what sort of a person is she? Nice, kind. Okay. And what happens here is that the person seems to divide people into two groups. Nice and kind, and not nice and kind. And here there is a lack of vocabulary to describe characterization. Where other kids, oh, she's a bit cranky, but there again, she's fair with this, that, and the other. And they will be fluent at knowing different personalities and different people's moods and changes. And so I also ask for a description of the parent. What sort of a person is your mum? Nice, kind, which is lovely to hear, but maybe somebody who should, by their intellect, have a more precise vocabulary to describe characterization. I then look at play with peers, and as one teenager with Asperger syndrome said, as he came in from the playground after I'd watched him playing very imaginatively on his own, I said, and why don't you talk to the other children? And his reply was, no, thank you, I don't have to. Well, no, you don't have to. So here there is a child who has a fluency of speech, and parents may have spent years trying to get them to talk, but now chooses not to with their peer group. So often that splendid isolation is quite comfortable for that child. And when we look at aspects of peer pressure, quite often they are not as motivated to gain the currency of the children. Whatever is trendy in clothing, toys, etc. And that means we are now actually coming up to Christmas, that Christmas presents for such children are unusual, where the media is telling you what to buy. We've had one child, for example, recently, who all he wanted for Christmas was road signs. And with a bit of ingenuity, you can do that. But then you can at least guarantee that when he opens the present, he's delighted with what he sees, because if he isn't, he will tell you. More on that later. Competitiveness is interesting because in this it's quite complex. That the child may lack the knowledge of teamwork and team skills. So in competitive team games like soccer, they have major problems of the unwritten rules. And we had one child who was learning to play soccer but was not very good at it. And because of this, they put him in defence. And what they did was put him right in front of the goal. Because at least even by standing there as a statue, he might accidentally deflect a ball going into the goal. So at least he was of value to them standing there. However, the ball landed at his feet, and the cry came up from everybody, pass the ball, pass the ball. And someone from the opposing team said, to me, to me, to me. So he did. And the person scored a goal. And he couldn't understand why his teammates were angry with him for allowing that. But he had no idea of that social common sense. You never have to teach other kids. They are born with that. You don't have to teach them friendship. You, in fact, as a teacher, spend more time stopping them socializing than actually encouraging the social element. Another aspect of competitiveness is that the child may have a very high expectation of their own level of performance. And if they're doing a page of writing and they get to the last letter E, and the E is just a little wrong, it's and thrown away. And the teacher, oh, but it's wonderful. No, it's not good enough. And they have a very high expectation of their own performance. And that is why, I'll just say briefly, as adults, I would recommend a tradesman with Asperger's syndrome. And in fact, I think on their trade cards or business cards, they should put Asperger's syndrome as a positive quality, because you know you'll get a perfect job. Okay? You know there's going to be an extreme attention to detail, it's going to be a craftsmanship approach, and no way will they sell you a bad product. In fact, many have major moral problems and have a strong sense of morality. Okay. So, however, that does mean that the child gets a lot of anguish if things are not right, and we have to encourage the kids to accept when things go wrong. One of the things that I'll be mentioning a bit later on is social stories, developed by Carol Gray, and I am a strong advocate of social stories by Carol Gray. But you may have to explain the unwritten social rules are actually written down in a story format, tailor-made for the child. And you may have to explain to them that it's okay to make a mistake. We learn more from our mistakes than our successes, that the teacher deliberately designed it to make a mistake so you would learn, and to go through the whole process of making a mistake. Because for many with Asperger's syndrome, the worst insult is to be called stupid, and they are very worried about that component. They may also have problems of what we call rank order. Where do you go? Always got to go first. Not necessarily to be superior, but to know their position in the line or the sequence of people. Because when you do tests and all those sorts of things, you could go anywhere. And that unpredictability, that chaos, is unacceptable. So I've got to be in this position every time. Quite often, the child doesn't understand the codes of conduct, those unwritten rules that tell you you talk to your teacher in one way, your school principal another way, and the other children another way, and they approach everybody the same. And they don't seem to understand, and I'll give you an illustration we had with a child who was with his mother at the supermarket checkout. And in this situation, he spotted a lady in front of him and pointed to her, and in a very loud voice, heard throughout the supermarket, said, "Isn't she fat?" His mother then said, "Shh, shh, you don't say that." To which he replied in an equally loud voice, "But she is fat." Now, several things occurred here. First of all, he was not aware of how that comment would affect the feeling of the person in question. It was not malicious, it was not nasty, he was just stating the obvious. Isn't she fat? Secondly, his mother's signals of, "Shh, shh, you don't say that, I'm embarrassed," were equally not picked up. And finally, the child was perplexed that he was being chastised for telling the truth. She is fat. And these children are self-appointed revealers of the truth. They tell you exactly everything. But when I talk to adults with Asperger's syndrome, they do say, could people please be honest and upfront? Subtlety doesn't work. So I've learned with people with Asperger's syndrome, if the conversation is prolonged and there doesn't seem to be a natural end and I need to move on, if I do all these subtle signals of I've got to go, it doesn't work and the person follows you like a magnet. What I have to do is say, "Thank you, excuse me, I must go, good to see you, bye." And off I go. And when I say that, the person's okay because I've shown clearly what I want. So it's very important to be honest and upfront, as equally honest as the person with Asperger's syndrome. Playground activities, often the child will find isolation in the playground, again playing very imaginatively, or I go and ask the school librarian, who at lunchtime is in the library reading about flags, dinosaurs, reptiles, etc. But often, where other children, their greatest time at school is playground. What do you call recess time or break time? Recess. And here it's social, chaotic, noisy, unstructured, unsupervised. It's beautiful. But for the person with autism or Asperger's, it's hell. And here they are at their most vulnerable and confused. So some seek isolation in that situation. The next one is deceit. And here the kids are breathtakingly honest. And if you say to them, "Did you do that?" They say, "Yes." And you say, "Well, oh, don't do it again." Or at the blackboard, teacher's doing something. Kid's naughty. Turns around, "Who did that?" Code of silence. In Australian terms, you don't dob in your mates. But the child with Asperger's, he did. And the child becomes the class policeman and goes around correcting wrongs and telling people what they should and shouldn't do. And many of these children think of themselves as adults, not as kids. They talk like adults, they think like adults, they perceive themselves as adults. We had a 5-year-old recently at a kindergarten setting that in the office the phone rang, so he answered it. Now all the other kids would know only an adult answers the phone. And so many of these kids see themselves as adults. So for other children, when they come up to them, they're that height of the other kids. But they talk, and their morality and actions are more like a miniature adult. And it's as though, for some, they never had a traditional childhood. Okay. We also look at facial expression. And here, as much as I said that the child may have a difficulty reading your face, you may have difficulty reading their face. And diagnostically, I developed a tool which asks the children to make a happy face, a sad face, an angry face, etc. And sometimes, if I ask the child, "Can you make your face look happy?" they'll go. And if you took a photograph and showed this to a stranger and said, "How does this child feel?" they'll go, "Constipated?" Or you say, "Could you make your face look sad?" The child says, "Oh, but I don't feel sad. And if I were sad, I would cry and I would look miserable." And I said, "Can you do it?" No, I don't feel. When I'm sad, and you get every logical verbal avoidance of it, but they can't do it. Or another child, as I go through the sequence, I asked him, "Can you make your face look frightened?" Nothing. So I asked again, "Can you make your face look frightened?" And he said, "But I am." I had no idea. He'd moved his eyes fractionally, and for him, that was his expression of fear. So sometimes you can't read their face either. So here, what you've got is problems with socializing, friendship skills, and emotions, empathy, reading faces, etc. Now, of course, this also becomes an area for treatment, but we also look at what's called theory of mind. Theory of mind being developed by Uta Frith, Simon Baron-Cohen, Francesca Happe, and others, which is the ability to mind read. And if you don't have this skill, it's called mind blindness. It's by contextual cues, facial expressions, all those sorts of things, giving an informed guess of what somebody is thinking. Now, in the diagnostic process with the younger kids, I give a particular question. And I have a storyline for the child of a little girl, and it's coming up to her birthday. And for her birthday, she wants a puppy. And so what she does is she tells her mum and dad and her teacher and her friends that she wants a puppy for her birthday. In fact, that's all she ever talks about, is getting a puppy. So comes the morning of her birthday. She wakes up and thinks, "Today's my birthday, today I get my puppy." Now what I'm doing is, as I use drama in my face, is the child looking at that or just listening? And she thinks, "Today is my birthday, today I get my puppy." And she goes into the kitchen. And in the kitchen are her mum and dad, but on the kitchen table is her birthday present, a big box with a pink ribbon. She thinks, "My puppy!" And she opens up the box, and inside she finds books. Lots and lots of books. Now, ordinary kids, their facial expression will drop as they empathize with the character. Books, she's so sad, no puppy. But her mum and dad say, "Did you like your birthday present?" And she says, "Thank you, it was a lovely present." Why would she say that? Now, I hope you know. But here, the child may do one of two things. Either they go, "The books are about puppies." which logically is possible. That's why she was happy the books were about puppies. Or they go, not to hurt their feelings. In other words, they have intellectually worked out what you did intuitively and with a speed of thought that was incredible. What's interesting is we can now give such questions to individuals and actually look at which parts of the brain are used for that function. And for theory of mind, there's a particular area in your frontal lobe that's very small that switches on when you do such activities. And that small area solves that problem very, very quickly. For those with Asperger syndrome, who may give you the right answer, they use a different part of the frontal lobe, lower and larger. And what they are doing is using their intelligence to cognitively work out social problems in life. And that obviously means that what we have to do here is teach them what's required. And that's going to be the topic of a later session. I'm now wanting to go through the communication side because there are clear features of the communication skills, which is very obvious as soon as you start talking to the child. The first one is related to clarification, to the ability in the pragmatic sense to repair a dysfunctional conversation. So in my interactions I'm a bit silly or make it a bit odd, and an ordinary child would say, I'm sorry, what do you mean? Can you give me an example? Or can you help me? Or seek to keep it back on track. And here, the child will do one of two things. I ask a question that they're not sure, and they'll take a long time to find the answer. Two things are occurring here. One, the child is not aware how uncomfortable that is to the other person. And so we have to teach such kids what we call safety phrases. A safety phrase is something you say to rescue the situation. I'll think about that for a moment. Or, oh, that's a good thing. I'll, etc. So it's a phrase to keep the other person comfortable. However, often people with Asperger syndrome say, as adults, please don't interrupt. Because if you interrupt, I've got to go right back to the beginning. And so quite often when I ask a question with a person with Asperger syndrome, I ask the question and I remain silent. I don't prompt, I don't intrude, I wait. And I know I'm going to get a very sensible answer if I give the child or adult time to work it out, but not to interrupt. Or, if in doubt, switch topics. Switch to something you're familiar with and that you know about. So if you're not careful, whatever you're talking about, the summer vacation, it ends up talking about dinosaurs. It always ends up talking about dinosaurs because the child has a degree of fluency, knowledge and familiarity with their topic. So if in doubt, switch topics. We also look at the degree of reciprocity, the degree of balance between the two of you. Is the child interested in your opinions, your ideas, your suggestions, and if you take the topic off to a tangent, do they follow you in that way? So what we have here is a balance of airspace where the child dominates the conversation, as in the social skills, or you have to ask many questions and get very monosyllabic answers in return. I'll just briefly mention one young man I met with Asperger syndrome who had been misdiagnosed as schizophrenic. And the psychiatrist at the psychiatric unit felt, no, I don't think he's schizophrenic. Could you have a look at him just to see if it is Asperger syndrome? As I arrived at the psychiatric unit, in the waiting area, I talked to the nurses, and the nurses said, by the way, don't talk about punk rock groups. Now, this was not a sensitive topic that made him very agitated, almost paranoid perhaps, or deluded about this. They said, he'll bore you to tears. So, I asked him about, because he was very quiet for a while and chatting away, and I said, I hear you know about punk rock groups. That was it. I had this huge lecture on punk rock groups, and in that situation, as an Englishman of my English origins, I could have gone away made a cup of tea, come back, and he wouldn't have noticed I'd gone. I could have died of boredom right in front of him, and he would still have carried on. All those signals were missing. But as he gave me this huge encyclopedic knowledge of punk rock groups, at no stage did he say, are you interested in punk rock groups? What groups have you seen? What CDs have you got? Etc. It wasn't a balance between the two of us. He just gave me this encyclopedic monologue on his favourite topic. And I'm sure he had great delight in telling me all this, but I really was rather bored with this topic, and my bored signals were not picked up. We also look at sense of humour. Sometimes the person doesn't know when you are joking, and you have to say, it's only a joke. I didn't mean it, and many figures of speech have to be explained. Or the child learns jokes from other children and doesn't know that that joke is not to be told to the school, principal, or the priest. And they don't seem to understand that you have certain hierarchies or social hierarchies as to what you say. They just think it's wonderful. And I know some adults with Asperger's syndrome who are prompted by their wives at dinner parties not to talk about this or not to tell that joke to this person. We also look at tone of voice, and here the prosody is unusual. That's the melody, pitch, rate, intonation, etc. Now, the prosody tells an enormous amount of emotional information. You add emphasis, and that change in pitch, rate, rhythm, etc. tell you a lot about the feelings of the person concerned. Here, with Asperger's syndrome, they are often more concerned with the thought and the content, the semantics, than the social emotional component. So here, the tone of voice can be a flat monotone that is syntactically, in the sense of grammar, wonderful, but it lacks that melody or pitch that you would expect. Sometimes there are problems with volume, and here it may be that the person is too loud and devastating, and their voice can be heard at 1,000 paces. Or we find anxiety inhibits fluency, and some, when anxious, especially in the classroom, will stutter or become mute. And there are children with Asperger's syndrome whose anxiety has affected their fluency so great that they cannot speak when anxious, especially in school or social settings. So mutism is something that does occur. It's rare, but it can occur with such children. Sometimes their voice or words is very precise and exact. And if you say, well, we did that in about 1993. No, it was 1994. And you suddenly go, oh, I'm sorry. And they are very pedantic and exact. We're very precise. And that pedantic quality, that exactness is unusual because some of them learnt language not from socializing, but from television or reading. And their language structures are quite different. And that pedantic quality, that precision is quite extraordinary. And if you make a mistake, you are to be corrected. And of course, when they do this to high school teachers do not like being told in front of the class that they've made a mistake. The child is not being a smart ass or showing off to the other kids. They are pointing out a mistake, etc. So it can be that the child will stress certain syllables, and it's that precision and pedantic quality that's quite odd. Some will make inappropriate comments. In fact, it's an appropriate comment at an inappropriate time. It's that self-appointed revealer of the truth. If you want to know your faults, the person with Asperger's syndrome will tell you. Okay? So if you want honesty, ask the person with Asperger's syndrome. Subtlety is not in their vocabulary. We also have problems with literal interpretation. So we had one instance at a family wedding when everyone raised their glass and said, let's toast the bride. And of course the scream came up from the person with Asperger, why are you going to hurt her? So you have to be careful. Did you say it's only a figure of speech? And literal interpretation, you have to be very careful. In fact, you have to be equally pedantic. Because if you say we're going home in 5 minutes, at 5 minutes and 2 seconds, you're going to have an explosion. You have not said exactly X. So you find you become Asperger's or autistic-like. You become equally pedantic, routine. Your social life disappears because of the difficulties with the child. So you find that that literal interpretation is a major problem for those kids. Now, the next point is late onset. And one concern I have is the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-4, and ICD-10, International Classification of Diseases, provides diagnostic criteria for Asperger's syndrome. And they were designed without really having the degree of knowledge, especially the clinical knowledge we now have. And there's a point in those diagnostic criteria that if the child has signs of a delay in language development, it excludes them from Asperger's syndrome. Clinical experience and the new research studies have shown this is not the case, and that the presence of language delay should not be used to exclude the possibility of Asperger's syndrome, because we find 40% of those with Asperger's syndrome are delayed in their language of speech. Development of speech. Certainly by the age of 5 or 6, they are talking in sentences, but they have major problems with pragmatics and prosody. So late onset speech is quite common, and often the child is unaware of the hidden rules with teasing or sarcasm. So parents have to explain to grandparents and uncles and so on of not to tease because he really takes it literally. And some, only a small proportion, vocalize their thoughts. You may spend hours, days, years switching on speech, and then you can't switch it off. And they go on and on. It's what I call verbal diarrhea, and the tap can't switch off. And it seems that they are talking to themselves. Now, it appears quite odd, and in adults may be misinterpreted. But what the child may be doing is literally they cannot disengage mind from mouth. The other is that they may be going through conversations they heard in the day to try and understand them. They may be rehearsing what to say tomorrow, or by talking aloud, it helps me think better. So it's used as a constructive mechanism in many ways, but they are unaware how others may perceive that action, how it interferes with the teachers addressing the rest of the class, etc. And many sitting on the toilet or wherever they just chat to themselves, and it's often a good way of tuning in to what they're worried about. It's not a sign of madness, it's vocalizing the thoughts. And you have to teach the kids, whisper it, don't say it. And some, later on, as they're thinking, you can still see their lips moving in coordination with their thought processes. So clearly, there are language differences within this population. But obviously, the major focus here is on the social aspects of language, in particular the pragmatics. But there is a distinct language profile. We also look at the cognitive or thinking side, and many of these children have exceptionally good long-term memory, especially for directions and as a photographic memory to remember what was in a room and so on. So long-term memory can be quite good. On reading choice, some are avid readers of their special topic, and you can't go past a library, bookstore or whatever without the opportunity to buy another book on flags or insects. And they are avid readers of their favorite topic. Sometimes for the girls it's not a scientific topic, it may be on animals or a particular author or adventure story. Computer skills. Computers were designed by and for people with Asperger's syndrome. Why? Because you don't have to socialize with it, it doesn't get moody, unlike teachers it does not get premenstrual tension or hangovers. It doesn't criticize you, it is logical and visual. And so for many kids with Asperger's syndrome, the way we teach is a social linguistic form for the majority of kids. The teacher socializes with you, dramatizes what they're doing and talks. But here, the major way of learning is visual and logical, not emotional. Emotion and logic are contradictory. So what you've got with a computer is that sometimes if you cannot teach the activity in the theatre of the classroom, they will learn it very efficiently on a computer. The computer doesn't criticize you. You can zip it back. You don't have to wait till somebody comes and guide you through what's going on. And I must add, as I may explain later on, computer science may be a very appropriate career choice for many of these individuals who find the logic of computers is just so natural to them, and that many become the school's expert in computers, and that the teachers always go to repair, can you do this, can you do that, etc. And they know more about computers than many of their teachers, parents, etc. So do remember that, because it is an extremely lucrative career, and as a parent, it may be something you can consider. Later on in this session I'll talk about sort of career options, but computers are very appealing. There can be specific learning problems, and certainly the learning profile is very odd. When they do intelligence tests, there's no consistent predictive profile, it's just varied. And so on one moment the child will entrance you with their ability and you think, wow, that was quick. But something which should have been at an earlier stage or slightly different is totally confusing for them. So on reading skills, for example, some are hyperlexic and are precocious in learning to read for accuracy but poor comprehension. Or they look at that page and they have no idea. Others are fascinated by numbers and see numbers everywhere and are delighted by the predictability and certainty of mathematics. Or they look at those numbers and they haven't a clue. So teachers do find that the learning profile is very uneven. Imaginative play, yes, the kids can be imaginative, but it's often not social imagination. It's not including other kids unless they boss them around, okay? And it's what I'll describe later on as the Frank Sinatra syndrome, my way. It's as long as you play according to my game, my rules, as exactly what I do. And some kids will accept that. They are very nice, kind kids who will do that. But with their imagination, they sometimes pretend to be objects, which is a bit odd. We had one child who, at 5 years old, a little girl, who in the school playground pretended to be a blocked toilet. Now, the Freudians would have a field day as how this was a metaphor for anal fixation or whatever. It's just she was fascinated by toilets, and at home they had a blocked toilet, and she was fascinated by it, so I'm going to be a blocked toilet. We had another child who rocked backwards and forwards and really was entranced by that in the classic autistic sense. And when asked, why do you do that? I'm car wiper blades, his special interest. Wow. So it's odd. It's unconventional and eccentric, but it's imaginative. And some will create new worlds. One of the reasons for dinosaurs, it's a time without people. Or science fiction, to find a planet where you are understood. And there is a website for people with Asperger syndrome called Oops, Wrong Planet Syndrome. And I explained that, I suppose in a way, if any alien was going to land on this planet, the first people they should meet is people with Asperger syndrome, who can tell them how to relate to these humanoids in front of them, who seem so illogical and emotional, etc. So the imaginative play can be quite extraordinary. You do have to watch, though, that the person may retreat excessively into their own imagination. And visual thinking, here a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I explain to teachers who, if the child has a problem, your normal reaction is, oh, let me explain. No, let me show you. And it's by seeing it, and more is learnt through eyes than ears. And such individuals are usually natural engineers. They need to see it, to visualize it, and then I've got it. But it's using their eyes as visual thinking. Now, we do have special interests. Now, this is part of the diagnostic criteria, but is variable for some, and I've noticed that with girls, the special interest may not be as dominant, and for some children, it's almost on the borderline of the usual crazes that other kids have. So there is variation on this. But what happens is that the child tends to find something that's not necessarily the flavour of the month with all the other kids, and they have a passionate enthusiasm for that topic of collecting data, statistics and information. But what the child can't understand is you don't share the same degree of enthusiasm. Now that special interest will come and go. It may last weeks, months, days, years, decades, and then stop and be replaced by something else as the child matures. But that special interest can lead to successful careers. We had one child, for example, who was an extraordinary expert on fishing tackle, and he knew everything about fishing tackle, and the high school said, well, he's coming up for job experience at this stage, and all he knows is about fishing tackle. I mean, we've got to get him a serious job. I mean, he'll never get, we'll get him at McDonald's or something. I said, no, try him for a day's experience at the local fishing tackle shop. Okay, off he went. And a few weeks later, I was back at the school, and I said, how did he go? Oh, he went. He never came back. And they hired him that day because his knowledge on fishing tackle was phenomenal. They often like routines, and in movement skills can be a bit clumsy and may not like some sporting activities because their fluency of movement is a bit puppet-like. May not be good at catching skills, so some sports activities are difficult for them. May hate handwriting and decide not to do the activity because you've got to write, and may need to type it or have an executive secretary to do it for them. And some may develop little motor tics where they twitch in their actions. Finally, I want to go through a little bit on pathways to diagnosis, and 6 pathways have been identified. One is the child who has moved from classic autism to Asperger syndrome, and these kids we would see with early intervention push them forward, and they are now best described as Asperger syndrome. When we would support such kids, a few weeks later the teachers would come back and say, excuse me, but you know you've got David and he's Asperger, yeah, okay. But we've got another one just like him, but was never autistic when he was younger. In other words, they started at this point on the continuum. And the incidence of classic autism is 1 in 1,000. In Asperger syndrome, it's 1 in 300. So the vast majority of children with Asperger syndrome will be diagnosed without a preceding history of classic autism. But they may have been identified by the teacher at school with their peer group notices those problems. The next group is that the family may have a child with classic autism, but as they learn about Asperger syndrome, they recognize that a brother, cousin, grandmother, or somebody else in the family actually has some of the Asperger's qualities, and so the diagnosis may come from a family member being identified with autism or Asperger syndrome. For some, it may be an atypical expression of another disorder. The language delay is identified and the speech therapist thinks, Asperger's syndrome. Attention deficit disorder is often associated with Asperger's syndrome, but perhaps picked up first, or other conditions like cerebral palsy and so on. For some, they may be picked up as teenagers, where the degree of stress and agitation at high school is so great that they break down emotionally with depression, anxiety or anger, an obsessive-compulsive disorder, suicidal thoughts and actions, or explosive behaviour is picked up by the psychiatrist who recognises Asperger's syndrome, or some, to a certain extent, may superficially resemble schizophrenia, especially when they are very anxious, and when they are extremely anxious, their sense of reality can disintegrate, and it looks like schizophrenia. And for some, are self-referrals or agencies refer, such as psychiatric services or forensic psychiatry. We had one who was, as an adult, referred for stealing a train. You cannot sell a train, you cannot hide a train, but his special interest was trains, and he took the opportunity as the door was open to the train to go inside, press all the buttons, and off it went. It caused damage, unfortunately. Police were involved, and he was charged with stealing a train. There was no malicious intent, but you have to be careful that the courts may refer this person saying, look, he didn't mean to do this, but something needs to be done, or employment agencies. Now, finally, the last thing I want to say is what is the difference between high-functioning autism and Asperger's syndrome? And it's very important that you're clear on this, that there is one significant difference between high-functioning autism and Asperger's syndrome. They are spelt differently. They are exactly the same thing. They are synonymous. High-functioning autism tends to be used for those who were more autistic-like when they were younger. Also, it's a term that is used for services, because Asperger's syndrome may not be accredited by government agencies for services, so a clinician will use the term high-functioning autism to make sure those necessary services go in. Where technically, yes, it really should be Asperger's syndrome, but as a matter of compassion and expediency, that's used. But the research shows quite clearly it's part of the same seamless continuum. So the next section, I will go through how to help them move along that continuum. Okay, thanks. In the previous section, I talked about what is Asperger's syndrome, so I hope you now have a greater idea of understanding the challenges that such individuals face. And I call such individuals heroes for coping with something that we take for granted as so easy, socializing. For the person with Asperger's syndrome is extremely complicated, confusing, etc. So what I want to focus on now is teaching what we call the social curriculum, those aspects of social reasoning that we take for granted that actually have to be taught. Now, if we go back through just very quickly some of the features in playing with other children, one feature is being very immature in their social game. So they will play at an equal level with a much younger child, but they don't know the rules of the game, the complexity that their peer group are playing. They need to learn those games. They may be content with their own company, and sometimes they're not motivated to learn how to socialize. And here, as one child said, "But I've got a hamster. Why would I need a friend?" And there's no answer to that in that situation. So some may be content with their own company. Others are desperate for friendships and long to have a friend or a relationship. Or when they are playing with other kids, they are very bossy and control the activity. And it's an authoritarian approach that's not a friendly, equal approach. So there are certain clear features that we've got to work on. What I'm going to focus on now is social play. Now here, when we use the term social play, what I want you to think of is a play as in a theatrical play. What you need to do is go and watch other plays or playing in the playground of other children. So this may be the young child with Asperger's syndrome, and go and observe their peers and note the script. Because these kids with Asperger's syndrome are very good at adult speak. They talk like adults, think like adults, they have adult speak. You need to learn the vernacular, the speech of their peer group. So it's noting the script and the acts. What games do they play? Hide and seek, whatever it is the games that the children play in the playground or at home or in their house, etc. What are those games? What are the rules? What do you do, etc.? And basically, you rehearse with an adult acting as a best friend, not as a parent or teacher or therapist, but a best friend. So it involves turn-taking, follow my leader, all sorts of games that you go through. But what you're doing is rehearsing the social games of their peer group. Once they've learned with you what to do, you do what I call recruit a friend or rent a friend. And here, it's usually a girl who's going to grow up to become a teacher or therapist. You know who they are. They seem to have a heart of gold and a natural understanding and tolerance of such kids. And so they become the stepping stone to playing with their open peer group. Now, what I'd suggest here is that these children need to learn the social curriculum. But the difficulty is the teacher has enough responsibility with the traditional educational curriculum, with so many children in that class, that child needs a teacher aide to teach the social curriculum. So what you would have is a teacher aide, and several friends in the classroom that work as a team to support that individual in the social aspects of life. Now, you need to explain to those children why that child is different. You don't have to use the term Asperger syndrome, which becomes Asperger syndrome, Hamburger syndrome, etc. It has its various misinterpretations. What you say is that that child is different. And here, Carol Gray has developed an approach called the sixth sense. And her literature explains clearly how to do this. But briefly, you go through with the other children the six senses. First one, perhaps, vision. And you blindfold the child and you get them to experience what life is like if you can't see. Earplugs in of what life is like if you can't hear. To imagine what it would be like if you couldn't smell, touch, taste, etc. And then you explain the sixth sense, that ability to perceive the thoughts and feelings of other people, to mind read. And get the child to then think, if you couldn't mind read, if you couldn't read people's signals, would it be easy or difficult to have friends, to share, to know whether you have offended somebody, etc. To get them to understand the perspective of the child in question, but once they have done that, to contribute ideas and strategies to help them understand. But these kids also become their protectors and prompters when the teacher isn't around, in the playground or when the teacher's occupied with something else. So these individuals are able to understand that person's perspective and help them in a way that is the stepping stone to their peer group. So recruit a friend. We also have, that we've developed in Australia, in Queensland in particular, is advisory visiting teachers who specialise in the Asperger's range, who are teachers who visit that classroom to tutor both the teacher and teacher aide in what to do. I, as a clinical psychologist and speech therapist and so on, have also specialised in this area to assist that individual at the professional level. So we have a very broad team coming in to help on this. Now, the next area, when we look at friendship skills, I mentioned, first of all, to look at the other children as a cue of what the child should be doing. Now, we look at the child themselves to check the errors or confusion in friendship skills. Now, this is a quick checklist. It's not an exclusive one, but a simple one you can use just to see how well the child is doing in particular areas. First of all, the welcome. In other words, when other kids come up, do they say, hi, or in Australian, g'day mate, or all those sorts of phrases that occur, that degree of welcome or inclusion. Now, clearly, if they spontaneously do it, great, wonderful, that was a very friendly thing to do. In behavioural terms, you reinforce appropriate behaviour with praise. But what you're doing here is having a pair of eyes that is not looking at what they produce, but how they socialise. So quite often the teacher aide is organising a project between the child in question and two renter-friends. But what they're doing is perhaps using bits of old cardboard and blocks to make a rocket ship. But the idea is not how good a rocket ship you make, but focusing on that child's cooperative, social and friendship skills. So, whenever that welcome occurs, great, that was well done. But if they don't, then you prompt them in what to do. Now, in behavioural terms, it is just simple prompting. But with Asperger's syndrome, the individual is extremely logical, and they must know why. What's the point? And this is where Carol Gray's social stories are a way of writing down social common sense in a way that the child can understand why we do these things. And they've got to know why to help with generalization and understanding. So you may write a social story of the value of a welcome, why we have it, what to do, and especially how it changes the thoughts and feelings of other people. And that's a very friendly thing to do, because I ask parents, teachers, and all those who come into contact with the child to regularly use the word friendly. Oh, that was a friendly thing to do. If, reading a story, if you were his friend and he was stuck down a well, what would you do? etc. So you talk about the concept of friendly as a regular component in your conversation to try and get a focus on what's friendly behavior and not friendly. Assistance. Here we find with many children the concept of help makes a good friend. And between the ages of 3 and 6, if you ask many ordinary kids, what makes a good friend? Somebody who helps you. Now here, there are two components. One is that when the child with Asperger syndrome needs help, to ask for help from their peer group or friend, not automatically the adult in that situation. And that friend won't think you're stupid, but they will think that they have an opportunity to be a good friend to you, and it's perhaps returning the friendship you offered them earlier by helping them on the computer. So, it's encouraging that when that child needs help and it's not working, to almost whisper in their ear to ask David for help in that situation. So the teacher aid is there to prompt, but also that when the child is in the playground or the activity, when they see somebody having difficulty, to offer help. Because one of the best introductions is, can I help you? It is an excellent way of introducing yourself, but being friendly. So it's going around the playground or activities to look for somebody who needs help and then offering that help. We also, on our checklist of friendship skills, look at things like compliments. A compliment is saying something nice about somebody. And of course, a good friend says nice things about you. But you may have to encourage the person with Asperger syndrome to actually do that. We had one child who was fascinated by tractors, and his father made some wonderful Lego models of tractors, very intricate and so on. And I was watching as the child was waiting for the father to finish the tractor, with and his mother was sitting next to them. But as his father had made it, he just took it. And quite often, the child is more interested in the product than the socializing and feelings. So in that circumstance, we asked the mother to whisper to the child in their ear, "Dad, that's a really good tractor, thanks." But of course, the child then goes, "Dad, thanks, that's a really good tractor," and whispers it at the same volume without realizing. I whisper, you speak. So it's giving compliments. And again, social stories can be a very good way of explaining why we have compliments. So in other words, it's learning in real life and prompting with the traditional behavioral approach, plus learning the background of it in a social story. It also involves including the suggestions of other people, to be flexible, because many with Asperger's syndrome have a one-track mind, the my way. But when other kids are here, oh, let's try this, let's do that, and that, and it goes in so many different directions that is confusing and upsetting, because it's not doing it my way. But when they are playing with other kids, they've got to be flexible, they've got to be imaginative, they've got to consider alternative outcomes and interpretations. And here, it is including the suggestion of the other person. It's sharing resources. It's initiating conversation. It's also dealing with empathy. So in other words, when your friend is making the rocket ship and making a section of it, and it collapses, oh, never mind, oh, it was so good. In other words, to give an empathic response to tragedy or consolation. Or, if it works and it's great, oh, isn't that wonderful? To share the moment. So your body language is consistent with the feelings of your friend. It's also learning the farewell of when to end the interaction, because what parents may have done is know rent a friend and invite them. When I say rent a friend, I mean you don't actually pay them. They do this out of the goodness of their heart. And in fact, many do it because they are devoted and like that child and want to help them. So perhaps recruit a friend than rent a friend. That child comes and visits after school, and they play together successfully for about 15 minutes, and then the child with Asperger's syndrome has had enough, and off they go. And the other child's going, hello? And they're stuck because that person has just... So you have to learn the farewell. Now that also includes appropriate signals to say, see you later, bye, or whatever. So when they don't want to socialize, they have appropriate cultural ways of saying, see you later, I like to be by myself, etc., rather than being stony-faced or rude in those circumstances. So it's ending and avoiding. So what you do is you take a checklist in the social interactions of what the child is doing right and reward it. And when they do, you reward not only that child, but the other children too. I think both of you deserve a gold star for being so friendly with each other. So the other kids recognize that being friendly with the child gets recognition from the teacher. So you want the whole atmosphere of the class being supportive. And one thing I would add of concern I have here in the United States is, unfortunately, some with Asperger's syndrome are put with children who are emotionally disturbed. And what's very important is that the child needs to be with ordinary kids who are not only an appropriate model for friendship skills, but are also socially mature, smart, and stable in supporting that child. So in other words, they are so good at the social emotional side, they know how to accommodate the child with Asperger's syndrome. So my preference is always for ordinary circumstances with support. The difficulty is that support is expensive and requires expertise, but that is the best environment. So we go through what the child can do, can't do, encourage, etc. But we also have what we call a friendship diary. And in that front of the diary, we work with the child through the qualities they have to be a good friend. You're very honest. You'd never steal. You'd never lie. In fact, they do this to a fault of being so honest in those situations. And that you are very good at Lego and so on. So you list those things that you have that make you a potentially good friend. But you also find that some of the kids say, oh, nobody plays with me, nobody comes up, I'm all alone. But when you watch, the children are coming up. They are giving the signals of play, but they're not picked up or responded to. So here you have to go through when someone was friendly to you, and they may not have recognized that was an overture to play with me or include me. And in that diary of when you were friendly to someone else. So in other words, it's a constantly updated record of opportunities for friendship and demonstration of friendship for that child. We also look at a component in teenage descriptions of a good friend is somebody of similar values, experiences, somebody who thinks like I do. And it's no longer, as younger kids, admiring physical qualities or the ability to be a comedian in the classroom, etc. It's finding somebody who thinks like I do. So for many teenagers with Asperger's syndrome, in a high school, who is like them? How can they find friends? So one thing we do is have a local or national register of people with Asperger's syndrome and their special interest. Because if a basis of friendship and meeting people is a hobby or interest, we had one child in Brisbane who was fascinated by ants. And he read about ants, and he knew about ants, and he would go in the forest searching for ants, and he would draw ants, and everything had to be ant-orientated. But he was lonely. But nearby was another young man with Asperger's syndrome who was also fascinated by ants, and we put them together. And that combination produced a real friendship. And so they would exchange, like kids do, they swapped ant books. They shared ant knowledge. They appreciated each other's skills, and they talked about ants. Other kids would be talking about football or rock music or all those sorts of things. Their topic was ants. So they had a genuine friendship in that situation. So one of the things that we also look for on friendship skills or cooperation is recognizing that if a person's personality or attribute profile is like a jigsaw puzzle piece, and the person with Asperger's syndrome has a very odd shape, what we try and do is link them to someone else who doesn't have Asperger's syndrome but complements their skills. So if you have a child with Asperger syndrome who's a brilliant draftsman or artist, in class you link them with a brilliant author or handwriter. And so the child with Asperger syndrome is the illustrator for the prize-winning book that the two have produced. Or, when working, I often see hanging from the ceilings or on the wall, this was made by Simon, this was made by Jessica, this was made by Kylie, which was fine as individual effort. But I would rather see this was made by Jessica and Simon, and it's Simon who has Asperger syndrome, but the two of them made that product. So you're always working on two people working together can produce a better result, because many are solitary individuals who go their own way, but they need to learn how to cooperate. And what's happening at school increasingly now is you are requiring cooperation and team skills to succeed at school, but in work, team skills are even more important. So you've got to start with friendship skills as a basis of team skills for long-term employment prospects. So those are the sorts of things we work on friendship skills. And when dealing with adults with Asperger's syndrome, there are books now on the art of friendship that you can get. And I will give a quick plug for the book I've written on Asperger's syndrome, that at the back of that is a list of resources, including books and material on friendship skills. The next topic I want to go through is to deal with emotions and eye contact. If you remember, we talked about eye contact being social punctuation, and to a certain extent you can teach that by getting the two friends to talk or interact. And now, in other words, you can visibly see or engineer so it's clear when to look. That's not too difficult to teach. However, how do you teach reading a face? Now at school, if a child can't read, it's picked up usually very quickly, and we have remedial readers and a variety of assessment tools and training programs to teach reading. But because we don't teach reading a face to other kids, we don't have the resources. So we're only very much at the early stage of understanding how to teach those skills. Now we start to teach to read a face by a project on a specific emotion. So our emotion project may last hours, days, or weeks, but you focus intensely on one feeling. Now that feeling, perhaps to start off with, is happy. So what you would do is you would create a scrapbook which includes pictures of happy people, happy situations, your favorite McDonald's burger, your favorite chocolate bar. I mean, I can think what mine would be: a picture of Earl Grey tea, a gin and tonic, a new Sting CD. All those sorts of things would, for me, engineer or associate with happiness, or a picture of a family reunion, or all those sorts of things. For me, I would construct my happy book. Now in that you would also add any compliment or success, so it's constantly updated. So when they've got 10 out of 10 for their English test, oh, hey, let's put that in your happiness book because I think it's a real achievement. Or something happens at success, oh, we'll write that in the book. So you regularly update it. Now this is important later on, because when that child is miserable, upset, and you need to change their mood, you can use the happiness book to change their mood. Also, for clinical psychologists interested in cognitive behavior therapy, cognitive means thinking, the happiness book can be a very successful way of changing thoughts of anxiousness, depression, or anger, and replacing them with happy thoughts using that happy book. So a scrapbook to do that. We also go through stories. And you go through the story so and so. Okay, now how could we have a happy ending? How could we make it happy so that the child learns to continue the story to produce that classic happy ending, that Hollywood approach? We do music, and we choose happy music. And the child goes through what music makes you happy, and sometimes music therapists can illustrate how music reflects mood. or mood created the original music. And what's interesting is that we do recognize that some famous composers had qualities of Asperger syndrome. Bartók certainly had many of the signs, and we suspect that Mozart also had some of those signs. We also know that some of those visual reasoning signs have been in such individuals as Einstein, Newton, and other famous scientists, also in philosophers such as Wittgenstein. And so we find that the way of thinking is different, but can be highly original and creative. So we look at music. We also look at colour. And here we try and associate a specific colour with a particular emotion. We allow the child to vote from their rainbow or a range of colours that what colour they associate with happiness. Some people would choose yellow or orange or purple, etc. Let the child choose. Now this is important later on, because then that can be used as a tool for the person to think, how did that person feel? What colour, what crayon represents the way they were feeling, which gives you insight into their analysis, but can help you correct and inform the child of what was actually happening. More on that later. We go through the facial elements. How do you read the movements of the eyebrows, where the eyes are looking, the muscles around the eyes, the mouth, etc., that all move so quickly that tell you if somebody is happy, sad, angry, frightened, etc. We have that inbuilt area of our brain in the amygdala which clearly processes that information. These children need help. So what we do is use a variety of games and activities. For example, there is one which uses a large wall hanging of felt with a picture of a blank face. And on the other side are a series of different eyebrows, eyes, and mouths with Velcro. So you can peel it off and put it on there. So for the young child, they can see. It's like that game, Mr. Potato Head, those sorts of things. But fortunately now, there are computer programs designed for young children on how to draw cartoons that have on the video screen or TV computer screen, half of it is a blank face, but the other half of the screen is a multiple choice of different facial components. So let's see if we can find happy eyes. With the mouse, click and see how it moves across. So you can tutor the child in finding those eyes and identifying the key features. So we look at the facial elements by using those models of what to look for. We also go through, obviously, what makes you feel happy, that's quite clear, but you also go through what makes mum feel happy. And you've got to explain that what makes you happy is talking about dinosaurs, but that's not what makes mum happy. And Carol Gray has developed some wonderful techniques of actually seeing with thought bubbles and actually putting the object in that thought bubble, of understanding what different people think about. So what makes your teacher feel happy? What makes dad? So you learn that different things make different people happy. But you also go through, what could you say to make your mum happy? And one child went, I'll tidy my room. Well, yes, it would make your mum feel happy. But often what makes mum feel happy is determined by actions. So I then go through, how would your mum feel if you said, I love you? Happy? Yes, she would feel happy if you said that. So sometimes you have to state the obvious. We had one teenager, his mother was in tears, said, you never say you love me, to her teenage son with Asperger syndrome. To which she replied, I did. When? When I was 6. Why should I have to say it again? No, 4 plus 4 is 8. Period. That's it. You don't have to learn it anymore. It's done. So I say I love you when I'm 4. I don't have to say it again. So Hans Asperger considered Asperger syndrome the essence of maleness. So what could you say or do to make somebody feel happy? We had one girl where we went through this for sadness. and her mother was annoyed with her or upset, and she wanted to make her mother not angry or upset, but happy, so she came up to her and moved her mouth, physically, because when mum's like that, she's happy and things are okay. How do you make mum happy? But what you've got to do is so that mum has happy thoughts. How do you modify her thoughts? What actions, words, etc. will change that? It's social common sense that you were born with, that these kids haven't cracked the code of this process. So no wonder at times they are very confused when you find things so easy. Okay. We also get lots and lots of pictures of happy people, happy situations, etc. Each cut out on a separate piece of paper on the floor. Also on the floor is a very large piece of paper we call butcher's paper, but it's a huge piece of paper with a thermometer written on it. So here, what we have is obviously the child knows what a thermometer is. If not, you go and put the thermometer in the fridge, you put a thermometer in the sun, etc. So that the thermometer measures the range of temperature. Now it's a thermometer to measure the range of emotional expression. But you're using a visual analogy. Remember, these kids are visual thinkers. Less talk, more draw, or more action than conversation. So in this, you may go through with the neutral face and the happy face of all those pictures and say, okay, which is the happiest? And you put it at the top. Which is the next happy in the line? And the next happy, and the next happy. So that the child is seeing a line that measures the variation in expression. We would also go through the words for happiness. Delighted, ecstatic, wonderful, etc. Each word on a separate piece of paper, randomly arranged on the floor, and then ask the child, which is the happiest word? Now, clearly, with young kids, you'd only have 2 or 3 words. With older children, you may have a couple of dozen. But you then ask the child to put them, what's the happiest word, the next happy, etc. So you're teaching that the body language and facial expression in one, and the words in the other. So you are making sure that they are developing their vocabulary to precisely describe a particular feeling. Otherwise, they have observed the extreme and apply that in all circumstances. So we go through that thermometer to teach that. So what we have here is our emotion thermometer. This one is the happy thermometer. We also go through vocal expression. So we count to 10 in a happy voice. We would also use the thermometer in many ways to identify, remember we talked about the music? How happy does that music make you feel? If your mum said, we're going to get you a mountain bike for your birthday, how happy would you feel? If you said, I love you to your mum, how happy would it make her feel? And then the mum said, oh no, it would make me feel. So you're clarifying that situation. So you are using that thermometer to measure real-life situations or engineer so that they become very fluent and precise in using that thermometer. They are natural scientists. You are now using a thermometer as a vehicle to explore the physics of emotion. Okay, vocal expression. We also take the happy book. When you look at it, happy thoughts. Next to that, we have a picture of a happy face. And next to that, a mirror to practice the movements in your own face. Here, we had one child was very rarely cried. But one day in the playground, something happened that brought tears. His immediate reaction was to run into the classroom to the big wall mirror and watch his face to see what was going on. Or we had one child, when his mother was crying, said, why is it raining in your eyes? So some of those components can be very confusing. We had one child who's standing next to his mother, but his younger sister was on the playground down the hill. She was on the swing, fell off, grazed her knee, burst into tears, and ran towards them. And as she approached, The child with Asperger syndrome turned to his mother and said, "What face do I make?" Okay. So often what you're having to do is, what is your facial response in certain situations? So we would start with happy and sad. For example, if somebody's sad and crying, what could you do to make them feel better? The sad book goes through all the things that make you feel sad. So if that child is upset, they may not be able to tell you, but if you take out the sad book, they can point to what is the origin of their sadness and their thermometer to indicate how sad they feel, and then you can use the happy book of cheering the child up. So you're using these techniques to get across to the child that it is important to tell people how you feel, because they can help you, and that you can change your feelings and take charge of them. Again, the essence of cognitive behavior therapy, to teach you how to master your anxiety, your fear, your sadness, your anger, etc. So we do happy and sad as perhaps the first two. Now these can be done with adults too, with age-appropriate material. The next thing we do is look at affection, because many in Asperger's syndrome, when they like somebody, they are very affectionate. And those they like and those they don't like. And I, as a clinician, will find at the clinic, if I hope I'm nice to the kids, but when I am nice to the kids, they treat me like their father, and they encroach on my personal space, etc. And it seems to be that they are not sure of the different levels of affection according to the person, or how to respond to the affection of others. So that when Granny comes along that they haven't seen for years, give them a big kiss. One of their frightening times is Christmas, when it's all social and emotional, and that is hell of misunderstanding what's going on. So we do affection. We do what we call the circle of friends. We take a large piece of butcher's paper with a series of concentric circles. And in the center we have a picture of the child and a picture of each of their immediate family members. Well, what we do is have lots of pictures of the child, family members, extended family, teacher, friends at school, strangers, etc. Lots of the pictures. And what we do is, with the child, get them to choose which circle they go in. The inner circle of family out to eventually strangers. So you've now got a series of visual circles. We then have cut out of books and magazines pictures of gestures of affection. A handshake, a hug, a kiss, an embrace, sitting on somebody's lap, for example. Lots of them. And then the child decides which circle they go in. And to see that when you like somebody, there are different ways of expressing that according to which circle they're in. But again, you are teaching social common sense in a visual way. It's not looking at each other and talking, it's doing the action together. And as they see the pieces fit together, it suddenly becomes much clearer for them to understand. And then you also talk about, for teenagers and young adults, stranger danger of sometimes their cues being misinterpreted. We also get, for some with Asperger's syndrome, it's not that they are over demonstrative, but the opposite. And some are too formal. And with their mother, it's a quick shake of the hand and that's it. And that's the only gesture of affection you get, is a little touch. And that's where you can go through, that in that inner circle, there are other things that you can do. We also not only go through gestures of affection, we go through distance using that same circle, or that circle may actually be drawn on the floor, that you allow certain people into your body space, but we all have a particular body space. And the body space of the school principal is there, okay, but for that of your brother, your sister, may be here, for example. So you're going through that. Once they can see it and you model it, it's much better understood. We also go through touch and topics. So Carol Gray has developed what we call the topic box, but what you're doing here is you're going through that certain topics may be appropriate for mum and dad. So as a teenager, it's appropriate to talk about menstruation with mum and dad, but not the postman. Okay? So certain topics may be appropriate or not appropriate to certain individuals. So when we've done happy and sad and affection, the next topic may well be anger. And here we use our angermometer. And if I go back through that original overhead, just showing that thermometer, what we may do is go through, first of all, the fact that everybody gets angry. So I will explain my own angermometer. And according to my family, my wife and our 3 teenage kids, apparently, when I get angry with an object, I break it. And I have learned, it took me 35 years to learn to leave it alone. And as a last resort, to read the instructions. I am a male. I cannot read instructions, okay? I am this omnipotent being who knows everything, right? I don't have to ask directions. So, apparently, when I get angry with people, I go very quiet. So my wife Sarah says to our son William, watch out when Dad goes quiet. Sometimes he's getting really mad in that situation. So we go through, in this situation, that being angry is okay. The problem is what you do and say. So I will go through, these are the signals of my increasing anger. You can color code it from blue to red, so you're teaching the child how to cool it. And what I will do on the other side is go through what helps me change my feelings. That switches from an angry feeling, if somebody says something nice as a compliment, it dissolves that feeling. If I can relax for a while, it dissipates my anger. Or if I can go on my mountain bike and burn off my agitation, my anger disappears. So what happens, we all have different strategies. So what we do with the child is then their angermometer. And these are the signals of when you're starting to get angry. You get very rigid in your thinking. You start to become very pedantic and exact. You start to lose your temper very easily, etc. But these are the things we can do to make you feel better, so that as you watch those warning signs, you can suggest from that menu of activities how to cool it with your thermometer. Again, this is almost like a cognitive behavior therapy approach of visualizing your emotions and taking control of your emotions. So we would have the angermometer. But another feature of anger, I've mainly focused so far on expressing your own anger. How do you know when someone else is angry? We had one child with Asperger syndrome who is fascinated by numbers, and he sees numbers everywhere. One day his mother was annoyed with him, and in her annoyance she was berating with him with furrowed brow. And as she approached with furrowed brow, he pointed to her brow and said, 11, which is the 2 folds you have there. He had no idea how, and some parents say, I think I'm so bloody annoyed with him, before he seems to realize how I feel. In other words, they only know the extremes. Subtlety is not in it. They're not like the British at all. So you've got to go through, how do you know when somebody's angry? So we have to teach the little signals. In our recent social skills group with teenagers with Asperger syndrome, we went through this topic of how do you know when you are annoying somebody. And one of the games we played was, what does mean? And one of the kids said, camel. Which, okay, camel was not my first thought when I heard that sound, but they were accurate but misinterpreted what it is. So you have to go through, how do you know when somebody's angry? So you go through mum's angermometer. So how do you know when mum's getting annoyed? We all have this. I, as a kid, knew that my mother was losing it when she had the breadboard and the bread knife, and we go bang, 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 bang. When I knew, hang on a minute, walk out, or change the topic, or mum's losing it. Okay. So my mother used to bang she has her own little mannerisms for doing that. So you have to teach the child, how do you know when your mother's getting angry, your teacher's getting angry, your principal's getting angry, your friend's getting angry? Each has a different way. So anger is taught both expression and comprehension. We also go through an apology card. Okay, after the event, it may be that that child has misinterpreted the cues or exploded, etc. So they may write an apology to the person who was hurt, offended, or toy was broken in that anger. And here it's a bit like a social story, that it goes through their own perspective so that the other person understands why they were angry, to allow some repairing of the bridges between the two of them. So we go through an apology card. A grievance book is where you say to the kid, basically, don't hit him, write it down. Remember, police, traffic cops, they write it down and then somebody else deals with it, okay? So what you're saying is write it down, give it to the teacher will act on your grievance. You don't have to do it yourself. Of course, school principals find these books invaluable in finding out what's going on that they ought to know about or shouldn't know about in that situation. So we have a grievance book. It's not on that list, but another point that I would add is you have to teach the child with Asperger syndrome that a person can be physically hurt, but also emotionally hurt by what you say. Now, physical hurt is visible, a bruise, a limp, etc. It's clear. However, the inner hurt is not so visible. So I have to explain to parents that if that child has said something offensive that has hurt your inner feelings, you'll say, ow, oh, that really hurt my feelings. In other words, your body language shows a vivid and visible recoiling to what they've said, because if they don't get that visual feedback, they keep going or don't know that they've done anything wrong. So you have to give that clear feedback. We also go through substitute words and actions so that if that child is using expletives to get rid of their agitation, instead of using the rude words of their older brother, then you teach them new words. And we have great fun with the kids creating their own expletives. Some of the ones we had was one kid said, oh, Frank, as another F word. Oh, chocolate cake. Oh, bucket. Being angry is okay. The problem is what you do and say. So it's substitute words. Or somebody, oh, sugar, when they suddenly realize where they are. But at home, they would probably say something else beginning with SH. So it's substitute words and actions. But many with Asperger syndrome are concerned that when people have antagonized them or set them up, and I'll come to that in a moment, there's a strong sense of injustice, that they get into trouble for their anger more than others. And that when dealing with teachers, I have to explain that the degree of disruption and damage is not a measure of the degree of guilt. And so before you act as judge, jury, and executioner with a child with Asperger's syndrome, you have to find out, did anybody tell you to say that? Has anybody been annoying you? Why did you do that? Right, I'll have a word with both of you. Because other kids see them as entertainment, sport, or live theatre to agitate in that situation. And they have perhaps a strong sense of injustice, that they get more than their fair share of criticism, and that they may have retribution at inappropriate times. Other kids, when the teacher's not looking, okay, as soon as the teacher turns around, nothing's happening. And the other kids know, don't retaliate until the teacher's not, and then it goes on. These kids don't know that. They retaliate straight away, and the other kids enjoy the power of setting them up in that situation. So be careful of that setting up, because you do have to work with the other children to make sure that they take responsibility for some of the actions they have provoked in that child. You obviously have to teach self-control, and you also have to teach that sort of counting to 10 or traffic lights where we say, okay, we use metaphor as much as we can, so a child who's interested in traffic, etc. Red, stop when you're angry. Amber, think. Green, arrow, to the side, get out. Because the best thing to do is when your thermometer is rising, leave. That really the mark of a man is somebody who knows when to leave, not to pursue the retribution in that situation. Other things that can occur, we notice, and perhaps is best illustrated by a situation as I watched a child with Asperger syndrome as his teacher at the front of the class was reading a story to the whole group on the floor. And in this situation, many children with Asperger syndrome promote in other people what I call the maternal or predatory instinct. Other kids are very maternal and kind and lovely and tolerant and beautiful, or they're predators, and they circle and take their occasion and do horrible things, bullying and teasing and victimization of that person. Now, unfortunately, the child with Asperger's syndrome was at the back of the class next to a predator. And that predator I watched was poke, 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 agitate. And of course, the child with Asperger's syndrome retaliated when the teacher was looking. However, the teacher had a fair idea of what was going on, so pointed to the predator and said, oik, here, in that circumstance. But I watched as another child who had been to the toilet came back into the classroom. And as he was moving between the children, very carefully, trying not to touch them, he accidentally touched this child and he was hit. Because the child with Asperger's syndrome could not read his mind and thought the action was aggressive and can't understand the motives behind what was going on. And we also find that once you have a propensity for repetitive thoughts and interests, it's repetitive feelings too. And once they're in that mood, that they've had a few unpleasant experiences, they see that everywhere. And that casual look, that accidental touch, that taking and borrowing something is viewed, almost in a paranoid sense, as far worse. And they attribute motives which other people wouldn't recognize. So what we do in that situation is use what we call comic strip conversations. Again, developed by Carol Gray. What they do is show what somebody is thinking and feeling by cartoons. And perhaps the best way of describing it is a pictorial representation of the different levels. It's quick drawing. It's basically stick figures. So what you do there is have stick figures with speech bubbles to indicate what they said, but far more importantly is thought bubbles as what was on the person's mind. What were they thinking? And using color to represent emotion. So if it perhaps the child has chosen red to represent angry, when they draw the thought bubble, it's drawn in the choice of red to indicate that. Or you draw in the situation an angry face, so that you have got here those little stick figures that may be what is happening, what the person said, but more importantly, what was on their mind. So in this situation, you can explain to the child that as he draws it, or you help him to draw as his secretary, because he may have difficulty with this, that what he interprets is that that was an angry action. And you say, no, it wasn't an angry action. He was actually being nice and friendly to you and trying not to touch you. So you are showing in visual form what may be on someone's mind. And it's a very effective technique of teaching theory of mind by thought bubbles and comic strip conversations. The great advantage of them is that you can then do a storyboard of a sequence of what happened. But if it's on, say, a whiteboard, and that's what happened, you can then rub out a particular phrase that the child said and say, is there anything else you could have said? This is to a bully, perhaps. And you could have said, I don't care. Or if somebody's teasing you about your hair, you could add another joke. If you did that, then you can see how the outcome changes. So you're giving the child a recipe of alternate options to different outcomes. So if that situation occurs again, and he does that again, for example with touch, a safety phrase of, "Why did you do that? Are you trying to hurt me?" etc. So the safety phrase gets you clarification of what's going on, and then you respond in that circumstance. We also go through some features of Asperger's syndrome that are also occurring often in autism, is that when the child is upset, they may lack precision and subtlety in emotional expression, that discomfort is expressed as giggling. It's not a perverted sense of humour. The child really doesn't seem to have the ability to express embarrassment or discomfort. It comes as giggling. So when the school principal is berating them for something or other, they giggle. Of course, school principals don't like this because it looks as though it's impetuous and lacking respect of authority and all those sorts of things. You expect some degree of subservience and remorse, and they're giggling. But it may be that they can't cry or show embarrassment. We had one lady with Asperger's syndrome at the funeral of her sister, as the other family members were crying at the funeral at the graveside. She was laughing, but it's in the phrase, you either laugh or you cry. And here, sometimes they can't cry, they giggle. We also check on self-disclosure. It's very important for the child. As much as you need help to learn to tie your shoelaces, you may need help to learn about feelings. But they may lack the clear vocabulary or ability to initiate the word or find the word in their vocabulary. So we do leading questions. So at the end of the day, parents ask the child, was there any time today when you felt really happy? Yes or no? Yes. Oh, what happened? Was there any time today when you felt sad? Was there any time today when you felt angry? Was there any time today when you annoyed someone, etc.? So here you're giving leading questions for a yes-no answer, which leads you into this area. Or writing a diary. And for many of the kids as teenagers, it is appropriate at the end of the day to write or type a diary. But in that diary, we use a series, what we call our pictorial dictionary of feelings. This is quite a complicated one. It's at the end of the book I've written on Asperger's syndrome. But it allows the child to go through the feelings and pick the feeling for the situation, the person, etc. Or, of course, it may be the teacher or the parent. And they provide a very good visual cue to draw in the margin or that's on pieces of paper to peel off and stick on the storyline. And for some, we do find writing a letter helps because there can be an insight, eloquence and fluency in writing, drawing and music that is so difficult in conversation. So at this point, I want to draw a close. We'll be continuing a bit more on the social emotional side and looking at long-term development, the next section of this presentation. Okay, thank you.